My name is Clarke. I'm frequently confused with Lewis and Clark in America, and it's a thing I've had to contend with all my life. No, I'm not an explorer. I think I'm an architect, and I learned a great deal about landscape architecture. I was born in Britain, and by lucky strokes of luck, I came over to America and absolutely fell in love with North Carolina. And that was in 1952. The rivers ran clear, the ocean and the beaches were deserted, and I could walk without any clothes on along the beach. I'd go to the mountains, magnificent, absolutely magnificent. I was basically a depression baby. I was born in the late 1920s, and my father was out of work, and so my mother and he moved into my grandfather's house, which was a substantial house, and he was a builder. Of course, I was born there and grew up for the first 8 to 10 years of my life in my grandfather's house. My babysitter really comprised two aspects. One was the gardener named Shuttleworth, whom I call Shuttlefoot, and from him I learned what happens to the tortoises in the wintertime. I was allowed to build a controlled fire from a very early age in the garden, and I learned basically from him the weekly routine. On Mondays, of course, the washing came down to the washroom with a big brick boiler in which the clothes were put, and a big mangle that mangled the clothes. So the other aspect of my childhood was the memories of my grandfather's builder's yard, which of course would be totally different today. It was composed of a number of buildings grouped, and the horses that pulled the carts were on one side, the storage areas underneath, on the lower floor, and there were brick mason shops, stone cutter shops, the plasterer shops, and what a playground for a child, because I could see all the building materials come and go. I could see the stonemasons chipping away at stone, and then I would go out occasionally, to visit the buildings. Now I must admit that what they were building were back-to-back houses, acres and acres and acres of these back-to-back houses, which we call terrace houses along the railroad tracks. Above these buildings, another uncle had a hosiery factory where all these women were in long rows with sewing machines making textiles. So that's basically where I grew up, in the old 1920s, pre-war days. And the house was called Arlington House because members of my family have repeatedly over the ages crossed between America and Britain. And I guess I'm following a pattern, having come from Britain out to America. Anyway, that gives you some idea of my childhood, because I think it influences and probably directed my way into architecture. Because I grew up from the builder's side, and my father was an engineer who ultimately found work, and so I wanted to actually paint the rest of my life and be a sculptor. That's what I wanted to do. But anyway, the war came, September the 3rd, 1939, and I was just about ready to go into the American equivalent of high school. So I remember listening to the conversations of my parents about the blimps that bombed nearby during World War One, going back into ancient times. So my parents moved to a place closer to my father's work called Loughborough. And there I started life as a high school person. And I went to purely and simply a boys' college. Growing up, I had a sister and a brother who were twins. I did much with my brother, who ultimately studied architecture. And we both went to a boys' school, and my sister went to a girls' school. So growing up, I really knew nothing about girls because we played cricket on Wednesday afternoons. We were in the Boy Scouts every available moment. Now, the 4 years in the equivalent of American high school in wartime Britain really was a tough situation. First, you were always hungry, because of the rationing, and you miss the candies and the sweets and the fats. And in harvest time, we would take off from school in the afternoon and pick potatoes and stack them up and so on. And in the summer, we worked on the farms. Now, here's another connection to my progress into architecture. Because of this past experience in putting things together, I was assigned to be on the cart where all the sheaves of grain were lifted up. So I would stack these on the cart, and on the corners, of course, I'd bond them. So it's a matter of putting these things just like a mason builds a brick wall. So I could build up this haystack on the cart, I don't know, 12, 14 feet high, and I became the greatest haystack builder of all time because of, knowing how to bond brick together. And so those are happy days on the farm, tired. And then what should I do? And I never got into the 6th. I matriculated in the lower 5th from school. So that was what I was, 15 or 16. So that's when I graduated from high school. And my mother had died during the war, and the housekeeper had a good friend who was an architect, and I became quite friendly with. And he said, there's only one direction for you to go, and that's to be an architect. Well, to be an architect in wartime Britain was kind of tough. The AA school, which had a good reputation, had transferred to another part of London. The faculty were very limited. Most schools of architecture, the men were gone to the war. So if you can imagine Britain during this time, there were no men. The only men left were the men who weren't qualified to go or were reserved in particular wartime operations. The school I went to was a provincial local school of architecture in the College of Art, some 20 miles away. And I was lucky because it happened to have a German refugee who was a structural man. On the faculty still was Richard Leecroft, who wrote the book on Elizabethan theatres and knew all about theatre design, acoustics and so on. And a guy called Chippendale, who later became a very, very popular head of both of Sheffield and Leeds schools of architecture. Edinburgh was a relatively good school still. It had kept its faculty, and being far north in England, it was basically out of the wartime activity. So I was lucky to go to the School of Architecture in Leicester, and I used to catch the 8:29 steam engine from the platform every morning. For 30 minutes at school, we'd stop 2 or 3 times in the 20 miles, so it was 3 or 4 miles. So I grew up with a steam engine and did architecture. I didn't do very well, so I didn't know what a scale was, the orientation to the beginning was not good, and I kind of floundered. But I did enjoy a few courses, like one called skyography or skyography, which is the art of casting shadows. So even in those days, we calculated the angle of the sun and then on drawing board and T-square projected each rays of the sun to cast the shadow. Well, this was very good because I learned all about form because of the shadow cast. And then I was trained in the sort of classical kind of architecture where I could draw through an architrave, through a metope down to the column head in section, and then calculate where the emphasis should be in the column, and then go down to the stylobate and the base of the column. And you know, there are three standard: Corinthian, Doric, Ionic, and so on. We basically had to learn to draw a section through with all the mouldings pretty much to scale, which of course nobody would ever think of doing today. And we actually calculated all our structures. You know, we started learning what an asymmetrically loaded column is, and bending moment, and so on. So at the end of the first year, they weren't sure whether I should continue in architecture. But my father decided, you know, give the guy another try. And they did. So at the end of the second year, I managed to learn the vocabulary and understood what was going on. And simply because then we got in, then I learned how to do a watercolor wash, how to stretch Whatman on a board, wet, soak it, let it dry tightly, and then I could do these wonderful watercolors. So anyway, my early part of architecture was basically very technical, not so much art, which I missed. Well, anyway, in order to qualify in architecture in Britain, you take your inter-exams, which are at the end of the third year, and then you take your final exams, which are at the end of your fifth year. And then, of course, you have to do your internship before you get qualified. Well, I sat my inter-exam just into the beginning of my third year. And damn me if I didn't pass. But I didn't know about that at the time because I was going in the army. Everybody wanted to be a pilot, but they were becoming redundant. And so I volunteered to a thing called Pioneer Student Corps, which was the Royal Engineers. It was quite a shock to be taught how to demolish buildings rather than build them. And the same thing happened with bridge. We took plastic explosives and put them on the bridge in such a way that you could cut it. So when it fell, you would leave one corner attached and the bridge would rotate and drop into the gap, which meant it was more difficult then for an enemy forces to build another bridge on top. The last thing you want to do was, in the layman's term, is blow the bridge up, you know. So I guess a lot of those skills and arts are now used in imploding buildings today, where you very skillfully drop the building down inside itself. And anyway, I wandered around the Middle East and Far East, and ultimately finished via Malaya and Singapore into Hong Kong. And the war was over, you know. Fortunately, I was young enough to miss the war. But I was there when it finished, so I was there to rebuild it, having been taught how to destroy stuff. So I actually finished in Hong Kong as a GE2, responsible for kind of repairing roads and rebuilding buildings and getting the hospital going. But architects in those days really could do anything, you know. I mean, one of the assignments was, we need some lights for the operating theatre. Well, we can do that, you know, so we did. But I was just a kid officer, you know, knowing nothing. But fortunately, there were great fellows there, NCOs and senior men, carpenters by trade, and they bailed me out. They were super. But anyway, this is just a long story into architecture. I then returned and went back to the same School of Architecture, and I did 2 more years. two happy years really, because I felt very competent in architecture by this time. And we were in a college of art with a dress design and some products. So I had a happy kind of very broad training. I was in a cricket team. We played cricket every weekend, drank beer in the pubs afterwards. So for me it was a happy time. Well, the rationing was still on. But when I came back to Britain, I was very disappointed in the population. It seemed to be benign. If you went to catch a bus, you stood in a queue, a line, and it seemed to be very down in the dumps altogether. And there was no material to build houses. You were limited to a very small amount of material. So two things happened to me as far as architecture is concerned. I became very concerned that architecture was a package. It was a building that would fit into an envelope, and you could sort of take the package and the architecture was inside of it. I became a little bit confined, well in fact very much confined, because the height of a room was pretty much fixed. A door had a fixed width, a fixed height. Everything was related to the size of a human being, even from the Greek theories of furniture and so on being related to the size. So I found that architecture for me was becoming very restrictive. I did not like the precision, and I felt that architecture was inside something. There were other things alongside it, so that as a simple thing, if you put 2 or 3 buildings together on a street, they form the street scene. But in those days, because everyone followed a certain proportion and precision and size in the building forms, the street automatically took on a uniform form. Where today, you often get dissimilar buildings next door to other buildings, where in the craftsman days of building you tended to get uniformity on the street. So I became a little bit concerned, and because of my Boy Scout background, where during the war we had very little occupation, I'd spent many hours sleeping outside, and I knew the trees, I knew the animals, I knew how to catch rabbits on the run, and so somehow I said architecture to me is dead in effect. You build using dead or static materials that you put together in an effort to portray life. And yet when I go out of the building into the land, into the landscape, the reverse occurs. It's alive, everything's growing, and in order to impose order, you put design restrictions on the landscape. I mean, there are classical examples. The Renaissance, say Versailles and the gardens, bilateral duplication, geometrical, a real domination of nature. And whilst I was doing my last 2 years in architecture, we used to go out on sketching camps, which is wonderful because I went to all these country houses and fell in love with the 18th century landscape, the 1740s, which was really cultured farming, and there were some magnificent things I saw, such as Sir John Vanbragh's Blenheim Palace, built for the Duke of Marlborough, and which Lansop Brown had laid the grounds out. And in fact, there's a water bridge that crosses the valley, and he flooded the lower 2 stories of it. And when you come in from the East Gate to look at Blenheim Palace now, some mile or so away, is considered perhaps the finest view in all England, and Pope and others described it as such. So here we've got two kind of outsides. Here was this great heavy pile of stone that Sir John Vanbrugh built for Blenheim Palace, and in fact they wanted to put on his grave, "Lie heavy on him hearth, who laid many a heavy load on thee." But for me, these were eye-openers about where do you place this package of architecture? How do you relate these packages together? So I didn't know what to do. I suddenly came across in this school, in the King's College, the University of Durham, they were offering a brand new course taught by a man called Brian Hackett, who wrote the book Man, Society and Environment. And he was offering a course he called Landscape Design. I thought, here's my answer. I can design a package, I love doing it, it's my first love, but now I've got a chance to understand where that package goes, landscape design. Maybe somehow I can make the connection. Anyway, I went up because I had just enough left in my equivalent to the GI grant to go. So they accepted me, strangely enough, and there were 3 of us, 3 students on that first year of the course. Brian Hackett, an architect with a similar indications to me, except he was more precision, he loved it, and Marion Painter, I do remember her name, and she came in with all the scientific horticulture background. Hackett was a planner, basically a 3-dimensional planner, but he introduced me to the Zuiderzee, the Dutch landscapes where the ocean is controlled to enable farming to go inside. I thought, aha, here's man control of the natural environment again for a productive good. So on this course, he left us pretty much to our own devices, would give in direction. It was taught more like a tutorial, and we worked. And on one project, and this is significant for my future life, just this little one incident, I happened to jump on a botany course held in the medical school. And it was taught by a doctor of science, a young woman, and her co-worker was an ecologist. I'd never ever in my life heard of an ecologist. So I, okay, jolly good, here we go. And so we went out on this course, and there were a couple of med students and 3 or 4 other students. And we took a 1 meter square, which is a piece of string, 1 meter square with 4 wooden pegs on the end, and you drive the pegs in the ground. There's 1 meter. Then they spend the rest of the week digging in this 1 meter square. And so you've got horticulturalists, you've got botanists. We had people from the edaphic field, soils, geologists, some of the med students who were studying botany. And very skillfully, they took everything out of this square and made notes on it until we got down to the subsoil. Then the geologist investigated that. They then put together a report that could tell the whole history of the land from that point. Because, to cut a long story short, finding out everything in there, the archaeologist would find out if there are any Roman remains or any Anglo-Saxon remains and stuff. Usually there wasn't, of course, in the place we chose. But for instance, if we did this in a limestone, in a sandstone area, which is the earth is formed by being laid down as sand, which is drifted and compacted. So a sandstone weathers, which is affected by the climate, into a particular form in steep and gentle slopes, and it weathers down like, say, the steppes of Russia. A limestone takes a totally different form, and the only things that will grow on limestone are a particular ecology, so that you'll get, say in the south of England on the downs, you'll get magnificent beech trees, because they're the climax for that thing. So, in other words, from this 1 meter, we could talk and describe how it climaxed in this particular, that 1 meter showed for miles around how it climaxed in that landscape. So this was ecology. And so I said, my clue, we make an ecological approach to life. Instead of having a 1 meter square, we'll have a 1 mile square. And then we can find out the history and everything that happened in that 1 mile. And it probably then had influence and created what happened in the bigger thing. And as a typical example, if you take, say, the Mississippi, you know, it starts in the steep land, the water runs very quickly in the river, it slows down. As it slows down, it takes the material that it's cut from the higher and deposits it. So as it slows down more and more, it starts going into oxbows, and then it ultimately goes into the river. So a section of any river is going to be almost a sine curve, produced by nature, totally in the natural process. On each side of the river are the deltas and are the tributaries that run in. So that river section, the river itself, has formed the whole landscape of the watershed that it drains. So that if you get a flood, an area that was an oxbow running very slowly with maximum deposition and turbidity would suddenly become, theoretically move further up, because the water would run faster. And then it would cut through the oxbow. So in the case of the Mississippi, the Corps of Engineers would promptly dike it again and cut through and make the channel now go through like that. It would reduce the length of the river. Well, obviously the river didn't agree with what the Corps of Engineers was doing, and it promptly went back to make another bend and closed up the gap. So whatever we do, nature is going to follow its own course of action. We might delay it, and we might accelerate it. And so I said, okay, ecology is the word for me. This is somehow now I've got to combine architecture with its dead or static materials and the wonderful design into this living thing in which we place the architectural package. And of course, it's a very, very primitive explanation, but for me it was a start. So I said, okay, Clarke, what do you do from here? So here I was, what, 23, 24, something, I had very early 20s, and I didn't know what to do. There was no point staying in Britain. To be an architect, the only thing I could really do is go into town and country planning. And for me, that was a deader door nail than just packages of architecture. So I said, okay, I've got to get some grants. So I applied to UNESCO, United Nations, every conceivable place in the world I applied for grants. And I thought I was doing pretty well to get to South Africa, Africa, and I thought that's probably where I'm going to go. But then I had applied for a Fulbright. You know, ridiculously not expecting ever to get a Fulbright. Anyway, I got a Fulbright. And then the next thing, Harvard, I applied to a scholarship at Harvard. Somebody else got it, but then they gave me half a scholarship. And then because I had a Fulbright, I got a Smith-Mundt. And so somehow I managed to assemble enough resources, and that September head over to Harvard. This helped me wonderful, because I wanted to work under Walter Gropius, because when I was a student in architecture, the Bauhaus was a particularly attractive thing, because here we'd been taught classical architecture, but we were basically fascinated by Mies van der Rohe Dudok, the Dutch architect who was building these great things in brick, and the Bauhaus, where Gropius had managed to get over to America when the war came. And then there was a book that came out on the market just before I left called Landscape for Living, written by Garrett Ekbo, a landscape architect on the West Coast. So it was jolly good for me. I'm heading to America. Goodbye, you guys. And so I got to Harvard, landed in New York. They gave me the passage on, I think it was the Queen Mary or the Queen Elizabeth. And the first thing I did was buy a big banana split in New York, And then I had to hitchhike to Harvard. But I had this enormous banana split, which was a great luxury for me. And then I had a wonderful roommate from Madison, Wisconsin. And I worked really between Gropius and this young guy I'd heard of, Sasaki. But they did a lot of collaborative work at Harvard. I mean, the first project we had was called Sudbury, and I became really the group leader of the whole class. We had architects, planners, and landscape architects working together, which was a new experience for me. And I introduced to the whole group this ecological approach to design. If you ask the right question, you probably will get the right answer. If you ask the wrong question, inevitably you're going to get the wrong answer, unless you're lucky, right? So how do you ask the right question to solve a design problem? Well, you have to find out first. So this business we had to do this design for Sudbury. And it's usually a very general design, redo Sudbury, how the hell do you start? So I went back to my old ecological days of the 1 meter square and said, let's put the 1 meter square around here. Okay, you'll do archaeology, you'll do soils, you'll do edaphics, you'll do... And so every one of each of the teams took on an assignment. Well, of course, this blew everybody out because nobody had seen this approach before. So the thing, if we asked the right question, we came up with an answer. When we got the answer, then you could go and design. So this whole new approach to teaching design landed me in a mess. I mean, I came to work under Gropius, and this guy Sasaki I thought would do it. Of course, I hardly saw him in Gropius, because he was getting to it. But I did become great friends with Vi Hudnut, the dean of the school, and through him made many contacts, and enjoyed the contemporary work that's been done by the group of young architects who taught at Harvard, Blue Moon Hill and so on. So anyway, then although I took courses and they gave me a degree when I finished from Harvard, which I didn't need because I already had one in architecture and one in landscape. It was a fine experience for me because it was really, although as a student I was teaching and loving every little bit of it. And we did the other project in Block Island. So what the heck am I going to do now? I've got 1 more year on Fulbright and I have to return back to the country of origin, which of course I was not too keen to do at that stage because I was excited by everything going on, and I was painting. And so they said they'd put me in for a Gropius fellowship. So I thought, well, okay, I'm okay for another year. I'll get a fellowship. But the people who award fellowships decided I was not worthy, so I didn't get it, So that summer I was working in Nantucket for the Four Roses Gin Company with this fellow, my classmate, having a ball and making more money I'd ever made in my life, because I'd do 2 or 3 paintings of the lighthouse and they'd all sell for $25 or so the next day, So I was a wealthy man for the first time in my life because they were buying this junk I could paint every night. We lived in a boathouse in the middle of the harbour, a life of luxury, and we ate in a big hotel, and that didn't last long. It was just 3 months for the summer. What am I going to do now? So I applied for a job at Oregon. I didn't get it. I applied for jobs. Well, you know, I guess I can return and start again in Britain. I've had a lot of fun. And then the guy I was working with, the roommate, had a letter from the School of Design, from Henry Kempeffner, requesting for somebody to come down from landscape and teach. So the letter was 2 or 3 months old, so I replied to it. And darn me, you know what happened? He sent me $84 so I could go from Nantucket down to Raleigh to be interviewed for the job to teach. So I thought, well, I don't know whether I can teach landscape. I'm an architect, right? And so I came down, and then to tell you another little story about those days, from Washington to Raleigh was an Eastern Airlines flight. Eastern Airlines enabled one to go north and south, and so I happened to send a little note up to the cockpit, said, could I visit the cockpit? I rode in the cockpit from Washington to Raleigh, which was quite an experience for me. Anyway, Ken Scott met me in Raleigh, and it was so hot and no wind, and I'm sweating like man, and he was in a ragged t-shirt, and spent the night in the Dean's recently built house on Granville Drive. And then I was quizzed by the faculty. This is Jim Fitzgibbon, Ken Scott, Duncan Stewart, Manuel Bromberg, Roy Gussow, Cecil Elliott, all the original founders of the School of Design who came from, with Henry Kempeffner from Oklahoma. So they put me through the quiz, and I didn't know what was going to happen. And I brought down some of my paintings in my portfolio. And so I left, and I thought, well, damn, I don't know whether I want to work in that deadbeat place in the south. You know, I could work up in Boston or pretty much anywhere for the year, because after a year I had to go home because it was of the Fulbright. That's when it terminated. So I returned to Nantucket and went about my business. And then I got either a letter or a call from the dean saying I'd got the job. And I said, well, teaching landscape, I'm not sure that I can do that. I mean, that's just a side interest. I'm an architect. I said, it doesn't matter, you can teach architecture as well as landscape. Anyway, I was a little bit late in getting back, and the semester had started, and there were very few landscape students. So I taught in architecture and really tutored more or less in landscape. Gil Thurlow was the only other faculty in landscape, and there were not many students. So I was able to teach a drawing course in architecture and in landscape. So for Henry, I was, I suppose, a perfect choice. He could plug me in to fit in wherever he wanted me to fit in. So those were happy years, and the school design started, what, 48? It was able to carry on into this environmental ecological work, you know, which I'd done at Harvard, and I came down, and so it was pretty well developed in the 50s into the 60s, and I was spending my time trying to teach courses here. I had to go to Philadelphia and teach the ecological approach to Ian McCarg, and he picked it up from us here in North Carolina. Then I went to nearly every school, there weren't many landscape schools in the country, teaching this approach, the ecological approach. And so the design aspects and reputation was carried on by the landscape department, basically through the 60s, I think. And the use of visiting critics continued because we were, we didn't have faculty. We'd get critics like Burley Marx came twice, Ekbo, Royston, Brian Hackett, the regular slew of great visitors. So, like, I was so privileged in my architectural training and so lucky to get the experience that I did. The students in the 50s and 60s in the schools I designed enjoyed it as if it was like a canned milk can. They could open the can and drink the milk. Well, we had all these visiting critics, we had the school, the combination of all the faculty, all there. They didn't have to go to different places to get it. The school offered so much. Ken Peffner was insistent on a school of design, which was products design, landscape and architecture, each indivisible, but they acted as a whole. And for instance, the first 2 years when I got there in the 50s, any student who graduated from North Carolina high school could enter the university, because just that was all they needed. So the first 2 or 3 years, because architecture is a peculiar discipline, the first 2 years were also filter systems for those who didn't have that inclination or talent. They could take something else. And so Henry used to say, okay, those of you now who are working together, there'll only be half of you here next year. And of that half, there'll only be another half next year. And that was one of his very proud statements. And the other thing with Henry in the school, of all that great faculty, with the number of prizes awarded, he calculated the value of the school by the amount of prize money. And so that first year I got there in '52, Roger Montgomery and Ben Gary, a landscape student, and Roger, an architect, and myself worked all summer on the Carson Perry Scott competition for the redesign of the Loop area in Chicago. And damn me, if we didn't win a 3rd or 4th prize, and that was another $500 or $1,000 added to Henry's list of prizes. Well, anyway, for me, this was the most exciting time. Everything had sort of come together in the school design in the 50s and culminated in working with the students in the 60s to put it all together. And the faculty in school design also taught me a great deal. For instance, I'd gone through, as I described, casting shadows, being able to do classical columns, having a big history background. But I got to school design, and it was 2x4 architecture. Remember a 4x8 architecture, a sheet of plywood, 4x8, made the jewel boxes that Matsumoto built. The houses that Matsumoto built were always built on a 4-foot grid to fit a 4x8 sheet of plywood. So the US Plywood Corporation, published many of his designs and so on. It was good. In fact, he built his house in '52, and I remember helping George put the tile in the kitchen on the town. We got very small rooms, very small bedrooms, very small kitchen, and the stuff was in the biggest space was in the living room. And 1953, I babysat George's house while he and Keely went to the West Coast for the summer. But and we called ourselves contemporary architects, contemporary landscape architects. The word modernistic, to me, I can never quite understand it. And I hate postmodern, because I just don't understand what the work in postmodernism is. But I could understand the work we do in contemporary, which is now called modernistic. And most of the work in the school design was in residences at the time. Why? Because they were small and cheaper to build than the conventional house with the big white columns and the up and down windows and so on. So I came from the age where the doors and windows and things were built by craftsmen and designed specifically for each building. Here, we still designed the windows and doors, and each architect had his own kind of framing and moulding, which now has grown into Home Depot and Lowe's, where all these are standard pieces, and you just assemble the pieces together like a jigsaw puzzle. So the modernistic design, or the contemporary design, as we called it, stemmed from the use of the materials and how they were joined together. And I think Matsumoto's jewel box houses were good examples of that. But perhaps the finest architect of that period on the faculty was Jim Fitzgibbon, who did the Pascal House, and I thought was a very great architect. So my work started working with Fitzgibbon. I worked on the house with him for Dr. Womack, head of the medical school, in 1953. So I'm really getting into my practice a little bit now. In the 16 years I taught in the School of Design, I was really concentrating on teaching. I loved it. I learned a great deal from the students, and the major emphasis was on this ecological approach to design. We did things like we studied the Neuse River from its beginning to its end, the Cape Fear, and how the watersheds they drained created the landscape, so that the students could be blindfolded, taken somewhere and dropped in the landscape, and they could read it immediately. They would know, the same way I described previously, that a beech tree grows on limestone, that a landscape architect should be blindfolded and dropped into a limestone area and be able to see it and understand it and read it. And the rest of the things I was teaching was architecture gradually moved in the 50s onwards into more assembly of parts and pieces. And I know that the Triangle Modernist website concentrates entirely on residence, so I'll try and keep my comments on residences. That in effect, if one built in the vernacular, which was to use the materials locally to put the building together, you finished up with a wooden frame building in timber country. You finished up with brick buildings, such as in Raleigh, because there's so many bricks. In a stone country, you finished up with stone buildings, because you didn't want to transport the material to other locations. It was known as vernacular, local architecture, from local material. So when we get into the 50s, we could no longer do we build vernacularly. We use proprietary materials and put them together, so that it's possible to build a house for Florida, Raleigh, Washington, New York and Alaska that's basically the same house with the same mechanical in it, plus its adaptations to the climate, so that obviously you're not going to put very exposed windows on the west side. And this term, that green architecture, obviously is a commercial application to architecture, because architecture should be green anyway if it's designed properly. And the commercial aspects of it now, to me, are very annoying, that a good architect designs the right building for the right location. But a landscape architect cannot do that. He has to build in the equivalent of the vernacular. So if he's in Florida, he's going to use palm trees. If he's in Alaska, he's not going to use palm trees. So the thing that I'm trying to get over is, okay, the architect can transport materials, but the landscape architect cannot. His character, the atmosphere in which the architecture is placed, is created by the climax of the environment in which it's placed. For instance, a tree, say a maple, occupies a space about 40 feet by 40 feet, and its root system spread to the edge of the tree where the water comes down, and its meristematic feeds the root, feeds the tree. It's more concerned about having an open space where the water drips off than it is close around its trunk. Nobody takes this into account when they plant trees in the city. And so these are the things that I was concerned about, how the environment and the precision of the architecture are put together. One is dead, of static materials which portray life. One is control of living materials for man's use and enjoyment. Both of them I tried to get over were controlled by the 5 senses. The only way you know the world is by touching it, feeling it, listening to it, primarily looking at it, smelling it, and hearing it. And subconsciously you do all these 5 things at once. If you go into an historical court, are you conscious of the echoes from the buildings? Do you smell the sewer system that runs outside? Are you conscious of the tactility of the surface you walk on? For instance, for one time, when you want to separate men and women after dinner, you could open the French doors from the dinner table, and the men would go outside, the women would stay inside. Why? Because you built big pebbles for about 5 feet in the paving outside the glass door. High heels would not cross over them. So the ladies stayed at the table and the men went out. Again, almost the same example of the 1800s, where the men left to go to the drawing room to smoke cigars, the ladies stayed, and the chamber pots were pulled out from the closet in the window, and life was civilized, I guess, in those days. But the architect and the landscape architect must design with the 5 senses. If they're not themselves superbly developed in the 5 senses, they cannot describe to the user what they've created. Because the user will only know what they've built by the 5 senses. So they must respond to that. And again, a typical example is if you take a roof, say a flat surface 50 by 50, and you put it down over it, and it gets way down, and you feel claustrophobic. If it's raised up, it can be raised up so high that it has no effect on us. You can walk underneath it and not know you've walked under it. So again, those are the aspects I loved about teaching. And then in the 50s, I started really in architecture. Gooley Odell, Cecil Elliott and I would drive to Gooley Odell's office to work on architectural projects with him. And in 1952 or 3, somewhere around there, 54 perhaps, we started working on the Laurenburg College, which is now called St Andrews. And the buildings were strung along the road in Laurenburg. And Cecil and I were working on these buildings, and it suddenly dawned on me, it's all wrong. I said, Gooley, we've got to abandon this project. This project is wrong. You know, because I'd started asking myself the right question. Why are we doing this? Why are they all along the road? And the college owned a big farm area behind with a pond on it, a lake. So I said to Gooley, why don't we raise the dam on the lake? That'll flood this whole valley, make a good-sized lake, and then build an island in the middle before we flood it. We can build a causeway across, since it's Presbyterian College, put a chapel there, the big symbol. On one side build the academic, on this side build the residential. So the students can cross the lake each morning to school and then come back again. We can put a perimeter road with the parking and build for the first time a pedestrian campus. So St. Andrews was the first pedestrian campus in North Carolina. You drive the perimeter road, go to parking, go to the dormitories on this side. The dormitories, because in those days the women were segregated in that set of dormitories and the men in this, and they came together in the student union in the dining room. And then they walked across the lake to the academic building. Gooley, bless his soul, agreed. And we abandoned all the work to date on St. Andrews College. And to me, that's what architecture is. We asked the right question, realized we could use the environment. It was a package, we could split the package up, so it became a total thing. And I think that's a typical example of what I was trying to teach and what we were doing in the 60s. So I really made the day with Gooley O'Dell, because then he wanted me to come any time and work on any project, and for many years I did that. And then I worked with Tommy Hayes, who saw the light too, and the Sneedle Boys in Reidsville, Charlie Boney, for me it was, you know, just so wonderful. And then in '68 I left the school. It had changed. I was no longer, I felt, really an intimate part of it. All the people I'd originally taught with had gone. I suppose I wanted to try and do the work myself. So in 1968 I left the school. I was very busy. I never wanted to be head of the school. Administration I didn't like, but this time I had done it. I never wanted to do administration and avoided it, although I did spend quite a few years on the City Planning Commission downtown, which I didn't like, but made my contribution. I did enjoy being on the accreditation committee for many years in the design field, in landscape architecture, going to the various universities. But towards the end of the 60s, Dick Moore, who was head of the department, with whom I loved to teach, and was a great teacher, decided he wanted to take a sabbatical, but he could only take it if I substituted as head of the department for him. So I said, okay, I'll play acting head of the department for a year. So here I was, trying to play head of the department, which I didn't like. The school had changed totally differently from what I had originally joined. I was teaching a full load and trying to run an office. And my wife said, you've got to quit. You just can't do all that. So I reluctantly, really very reluctantly, stopped teaching and decided now is the time to put what I've been teaching into practice. So that's what I did. In '68, I formally opened my practice. Up until that time, I'd had a little office above the Varsity Theatre on Hillsborough Street, and like all the other faculty, I'd worked out of my basement, since in the early days of the school of design we weren't allowed to put our name in the phone book, and the dean got work for most people as consultants to local architects, because you weren't allowed to practice if you were teaching. But that of course changed to like it was elsewhere in the country, ultimately. So in '68 I left the school, and I think that answers the question of how I got into architecture. I loved it. I still feel that I'm basically an architect, my first love, but my life has been practicing landscape architecture. I understood the package, did not want to work particularly on the package and worked on the environment in which the packages are located. And so I will leave it at that, because if you want to see my work, it's all over in the library, in the archived, in the special collections, and it speaks for itself. And thank you.